The dairy market has shifted more toward an emphasis on component production in recent years, giving farmers an important incentive to think about optimizing for those components rather than just focusing on the overall volume of milk they could produce. So, what can dairy farmers do in terms of management and production to optimize for those components? Welcome to Feedstuffs in Focus, our podcast taking a deeper look at big issues in the livestock, poultry, grain, and feed industries. I'm your host, Andy Vance. Thanks for joining us. In this episode, we hear from a livestock nutritionist who helps dairy producers answer that very question about optimizing for components. She'll share her advice on management and feeding practices with an eye toward components in specific. This episode is sponsored by Novus International Incorporated, a leader in dairy, poultry, and swine nutrition solutions driven by science. Novus's products and services look at the whole animal, focusing on productivity and well-being in order to feed the world affordable and wholesome food. For more information, visit the Novus website at novusint.com. Hannah Tucker is a ruminant technical services manager at Novus, working with livestock producers in the U.S. and in Canada. Dr. Tucker grew up in Michigan's scenic dairy country and received her bachelor's degree in animal science at Michigan State University. She then pursued her master's in dairy science at Virginia Tech under Dr. Mike Akers, and then went on to study her doctoral degree in animal science under Dr. Kristy Daniels. Upon graduation, she worked as a ruminant nutritionist at Sioux Nation Ag, troubleshooting for both dairy and beef customers, and in July of this year, started her career at Novus. Dr. Tucker, it occurs to me as I think about the dairy markets and where the industry is, we have to keep our pencils pretty sharp, but I think there's more and more awareness of the importance of milk components as we think about the overall pricing of milk, the premiums that are available for milk, for really focusing on these components. Could you, as a nutritionist, I won't ask you to pretend to be an ag economist, but as a nutritionist, maybe think through or talk us through the importance of thinking about everything we're producing here when we're talking about raising cows and making milk.
Yeah, I think that everyone should take a step back and not just be focused in one specific area. So something I always try to pay attention to is where is the industry as a whole going? And overall, pricing has been shifting more and more towards components. And what you're seeing on the plant side is that, cheese plants are going in. There's been an increased demand for butter, not necessarily in the United States, but definitely overseas. And when I have to pay attention to that as a nutritionist is that means our components need to go up. Our milk fat and our milk protein become a bigger proportion of the paycheck that's coming into the dairy farmer overall. So we want to make sure that we're optimizing that as much as possible. Thinking about that, when I do have a conversation with a dairy farmer, I always get on my soapbox a little bit and talk about not just percentage of milk protein or milk fat, because it's also, you're not paid by percentage, you're paid by yield. So sometimes what I think gets lost in translation is making sure we're paying attention to what is actually coming out of the bulk tank on a pounds basis and not just as a percentage basis overall. And that can really change how you look at individual products, just because you might see an increase in milk yield that will also impact your total amount of components as well, but you don't see an increase in the percentage.
You were talking about conversations you have with dairy producers, and that was one of the things I was wondering about, given your role in technical services. How often are you getting, a call from a customer or from a producer in the field where they're really thinking about this problem and saying, okay, doc, how do I make this work? Is this something that you're initiating a lot of those conversations, or is there a strong interest out there among producers in figuring out how to unlock all of that potential?
Oh, I would definitely say dairy farmers are on the front edge of trying to figure out how can we best optimize the paycheck coming in to my farm, because, it is a business at the end of the day. And one of the top conversations overall I see is pushing that limit of production on the component side. There is going to be a difference, obviously, for the goal at the end of the day, especially looking at breed, looking at the type of farm that you have, the type of labor that's available to you, and the types of feed sources as well. But if we can optimize individually on the farm what they can get at the end of the day, that's definitely part of the conversation that they're bringing to the table, and I'm not having to wait around and ask about it because they're seeing that the price increases are happening on the component side and not, necessarily on total milk production.
That's a question I was thinking about too, is you're looking at, and you talked about some of the limits or the things that, the different factors that are at play, breed, type of operation, and so on. Are there some general, and this is where I want to start digging into your subject matter expertise as a nutritionist and animal scientist. What are some of the general, I'll say, trade-offs, and maybe I'm showing my biases as an economist, assuming that there is always a trade-off. But physiologically, what are some of the trade-offs between, let's say I'm focusing on pounds and total productivity versus, hey, I really want to increase, milk fat, or I really want to increase protein, and so on. Could you talk us through some of the general relationships that you think about as you start trying to untie that knot?
So I'll be the first one to say milk protein's the hardest one to push. So then that means that we're going to focus more on yield or on fat, just depending on what the end, what the goal is, what your benchmarks are sitting at already. One of the big things is to always make sure your cows are comfortable. That can entail a lot of different things. I think include stocking density, that can include the type of bedding that you have them on. Are you working that bedding, making sure that they do want to lay down and ruminate? Is there feed in front of them when they come back from the parlor? Even throughout the entire day, is there feed in front of them? How many push-ups are you doing? So there's a lot of different factors that can play into it that aren't even the ration that I'm putting in front of those cows whatsoever. So it's a really tricky thing to point at one thing. I would say I always like to go back to the idea that it's about mitigating your risk as much as possible. So if we can get into this big idea of we're all working as a team to make sure that we can optimize it as much as possible, but recognize that there's limitations. That's where benchmarking really comes into play to make sure that we can keep increasing and keep moving towards the goal at the end of the day. And then, hopefully we'll reach that goal and then we can start working on other things. If that's okay, we've reached our milk yield. Now we want to increase our milk fat goal, for example.
And before we dig into some of the things we can do, like supplementation wise or ingredient choices, are there things you see when you go out and you work a farm, you're talking to a producer? Are there management practices or just a general set of recommendations that you say, hey, if I go out to an operation, maybe 5, 6, 7 of 10 farms that I go on, here are some things that they could do to better optimize or improve management practices and feeding to try to do a better job with these components?
I would say that I don't have a generality of saying in, 8 of my 10 farms that I first started working with did this. What I would say is dairy men and women, we know the answers because we've been listening to the universities and what kind of research is coming out. But when I start setting up cameras and doing walkthroughs, that's when it really comes out what's actually happening and not what the protocol says. And protocol drift is the big one that I find being the issue. We There's so many smart people that work in our industry that know exactly what needs to be done day in and day out, but they're just so busy that they can't make sure that there's not protocol drift within themselves, within their labor force. You know, we can only do so many different things at the end of the day. This is something that kind of gets lost in translation. And just coming back to those protocols that we have written down to make sure that we're following them, that's what I really see as being the biggest change that can help optimize a farm.
Now let's start to dig into, the nuts and bolts when you're looking at a ration. We know, income over feed costs is something that we're always concerned about, and high feed costs now in particular. So as we think about things we can do from a feeding standpoint, supplementation, what are some recommendations or some advice that you would offer to dairy producers and fellow nutritionists who are listening?
Right now, my main focus has really been on milk fat, and I've kind of taken the other approach. Instead of starting at the rumen, it's more starting at the mammary gland and thinking about it physiologically, what's going on for milk fat and how can we optimize it. There's a lot of really good research coming out of the Northeast looking at the proportion of short chain fatty acids and long chain fatty acids. And so when I'm talking about short chain, I'm talking about the fatty acids that are being produced in the mammary gland itself, the de novo fatty acids, versus the long chain being either from the adipose tissue or directly from the diet of the animal. And they're doing bulk tank testing to see what's actually going on for the herd overall. The research right now is not there to be able to really start making specific recommendations on an individual cow level, but it's really gotten me thinking about this push for making sure that we have so much fat in the diet, especially like you said, there's been an increase in ration costs, and I would say fat is one of those costs that's really increased overall. What I have noticed with some farms that have high producing cows for milk fat is that there's almost like a ledge where they can't overcome it. And my theory is that they're not looking at the ratio is off for the milk fat, and that there needs to be more short chain fatty acids to push those cows into the higher bracket for a percentage of milk fat. And that would mean that there would need to be more NDF digestibility to increase the amount of acetate and butyrate that's coming out of the rumen overall. There's not a lot of products that can really help with that, but I think making sure that there is enough effective NDF and that it's actually getting digested in the rumen is something that dairymen should really start looking at to make sure that the proportion of short chain fatty acids to long chain fatty acids are in the correct ratio. And that's going to start pushing their milk fat percentage higher and higher and end up in the paycheck at the end of the day.
When we're talking about, components, we've talked a lot about milk fat, and you mentioned that protein is one of the more challenging components to try to optimize for. When we start thinking about supplementation, and I want to talk about methionine for a minute, what are the general concepts there or recommendations there in terms of how methionine can help us boost fat and protein? Is that a tool we need to be paying more attention to?
Oh, absolutely. So, I mean, it works on two different ways depending on the product that you're looking at. For Novus specifically, we have an HMTBA product, which is not directly methionine. It has to be transformed to methionine within the animal itself. But what HMTBA is able to do is be a methionine source, so directly go into milk protein, and then also work within the rumen to help with milk fat depression. That's something that we didn't talk about before, but when we have a milk fat depression problem, the farmer knows about it. However, there's more and more of an idea that as we're pushing these cows, we're decreasing the amount of effective fiber, and we're also decreasing the chop length, potentially slug feeding, increasing the amount of fermentability in the feed. And there might be something like subclinical milk fat depression that's going on. So what we're able to find with our HMTBA product is that it's actually able to help maintain the production of through the normal channel and not go into milk fat depression and maintain milk fat levels at the mammary gland.
As we wrap up our time together, Dr. Tucker, I was hoping you might be able to kind of give us a final thought, if you will, as you're kind of summarizing. We've covered a lot of ground and a lot of different things. If you want to maybe put together a couple, two, three final words of wisdom, or distill down some of the recommendations we've talked about for producers and nutritionists to help them really take advantage of the way pricing is moving with regard to components and what they can do at the feed bunk to get it done.
Taking a step back and making sure that you're doing all the little things right, looking at your management and what's going on at the individual cow level, making sure that they have time for rumination, that the feed is sitting in front of them and maximizing the amount of feed that they can eat. Taking a look at your rations with your nutritionist, having that conversation to see if you're optimizing the input versus the output. And making those little changes, I think, go a long way towards really maximizing what you can get out of the cow. And then you can start really nitpicking and pushing those component levels. Because honestly, I don't think that we've maximized the threshold. And there's still a long ways we can go, especially with milk fat production.
Thanks to Dr. Hannah Tucker, and thanks to our sponsor for this episode, Novus International, a leader in dairy, poultry, and swine nutrition solutions driven by science. Novus's products and services look at the whole animal, focusing on productivity and well-being, in order to feed the world affordable and wholesome food. For more information, visit the Novus website, novusint.com. I'm Andy Vance, and you've been listening to Feedstuffs in Focus. Thanks for joining us today. If you want to hear more conversations about some of the big issues affecting the livestock, poultry, grain, and feed industries, subscribe to this podcast on your favorite platforms, including Apple and Google Podcasts, or you can check out the website, feedstuffs.com, for future episodes. Until next time, have a great day, and thanks for listening.